Keir Starmer didn't want this. He resisted it for years. But now, under crushing pressure from King Charles, Nigel Farage, and the British public, Keir Starmer has been forced into launching the very inquiry he once dismissed as a far-right dog whistle. The man who once looked the other way now stands at the centre of Britain's biggest reckoning. And it's not just any inquiry. This one demands immediate deportation of those found guilty from India, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, who raped and trafficked British girls. It's a stunning U-turn, one that Starmer had no choice but to make. But the question still burns in every honest citizen's mind. Why now? Why only after years of denial, silence, and insult toward those who dared speak out? And what about the victims? Those who were ignored, labelled, and abandoned? Let's pull back the curtain. Because the truth behind Starmer's sudden shift is darker than Downing Street dares to admit. For over a decade, the British public demanded answers. Survivors cried out for justice. Whistleblowers risked careers and reputations. Investigative journalists, especially from outlets like GB News, uncovered evidence pointing to a coordinated silence, a refusal to act, out of fear that speaking up might be labelled racist. But amid this chaos, one voice in particular remained disturbingly quiet: Keir Starmer. As former Director of Public Prosecutions, Starmer had the legal authority and responsibility to confront the grooming gang epidemic. But instead of standing with the victims, he chose the path of least resistance: political self-preservation. Fast forward to today. The pressure has reached boiling point. This time, it wasn't just Farage lighting the fire. Even King Charles is said to have privately raised concerns about the government's lack of accountability in tackling grooming gang atrocities. That's how far this has gone, when even the Crown is intervening in what should have been a basic duty of any decent government. And now Keir Starmer is scrambling. His team has announced a major national inquiry, with sweeping powers to compel witnesses and drag the truth into daylight. The twist? This inquiry doesn't just aim to investigate cover-ups. It explicitly calls for deportation of foreign-born men from India, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, convicted of raping British women. This is a line Starmer refused to cross for years. In fact, anyone who suggested it was shouted down as a xenophobe or accused of inciting division. But now the evidence is undeniable. The victims, white working-class girls across dozens of UK towns, have suffered in silence long enough. From Rotherham to Rochdale, Telford to Oldham, the horror stories are the same. Police looking the other way, councils protecting reputations, and criminals walking free. For too long, political correctness was weaponised to shield the guilty. But something has snapped in the public consciousness. The tide has turned, and Starmer, once an obstacle to justice, is now desperately trying to ride the wave. Make no mistake, this is not a voluntary act of leadership. It's a panic response, a forced hand. Because if Starmer truly believed in accountability, he would have launched this inquiry years ago, when the first reports emerged, when survivors begged for action, when whistleblowers warned about systematic failures. Instead, he watched from the sidelines, dismissed the concerns as overblown, and did nothing. So why now? It all changed after two thunderous moments. First, Nigel Farage's relentless public pressure, on air in Parliament and across social media, made it impossible for Starmer to maintain his silence. Farage didn't just demand justice, he demanded an apology. He called out the Prime Minister by name and accused him of playing political games with the lives of vulnerable girls. And second, Baroness Casey's report, which hasn't even been fully released yet, was leaked internally. And what it contains reportedly shook Downing Street to its core. The whispers inside Westminster are chilling. Sources say the report links the scandal directly to the Pakistani community and outlines how local authorities systematically covered up rape and trafficking cases to avoid being labelled racist. If these allegations are confirmed, this would mean one of the biggest institutional failures in modern British history, on par with the Post Office Horizon scandal and the Jimmy Savile cover-up. But here's what makes this even more shocking. Downing Street insiders reportedly fear civil unrest, on a scale not seen since the Southport riots. That's how explosive the Casey findings are believed to be. And it's why Starmer, backed into a corner, made the late-night announcement to greenlight a statutory inquiry. He's not leading, he's reacting. And now, for the first time, he can't hide from it. This inquiry, which he once mocked, will now have full legal power under the Inquiries Act. It will summon witnesses, force councils and police to testify, and follow the evidence wherever it leads. And if it confirms what many already know, that grooming gangs were allowed to operate with near impunity due to race-based political sensitivities, then it won't just be the criminals in the dock, it will be the entire political class, Starmer included. Because this isn't just about the crimes committed, it's about the crimes covered up, the emails buried, the whistleblowers silenced, the survivors ignored. Nigel Farage wasted no time. The moment Keir Starmer's announcement hit the press, Farage took to every available platform to say what millions of British citizens have been thinking for years. This should have happened long ago, and Starmer must apologise. Not just for delay, not just for inaction, but for the way victims and truth-tellers were ridiculed, shamed, and cast aside for daring to speak up. Because while the country was screaming for justice, Keir Starmer and his allies were too busy protecting reputations, clinging to political correctness, and branding whistleblowers as bigots. That's the real scandal. Not just the crimes themselves, but the willful blindness of those in power. Farage reminded everyone that this wasn't Starmer's first encounter with the grooming gang issue. As Director of Public Prosecutions, Starmer sat at the top of the legal food chain during some of the most crucial years when these atrocities were emerging. He had access to case files. He had the authority to demand action. But what did he do? Nothing that changed the culture of denial. Nothing that broke through the suffocating fear of being seen as racist. In fact, under his watch, prosecutions were often hesitant, patchy, and inconsistent, even as victims poured into police stations and social services pleaded for help. And now, in 2025, he suddenly decides to care. That's not courage, it's damage control. But Farage didn't stop there. He turned his fire directly on Starmer's recent comments, where he accused those calling for an inquiry of jumping on a far-right bandwagon. Farage was blunt. Those weren't dog whistles. Those were sirens, and they were ignored. He demanded an apology not for himself, but for the countless survivors who were told they were exaggerating. For the parents who were labelled racists just for asking why the police wouldn't arrest known predators. For the counsellors and journalists who risked everything to break the silence, only to be met with smears and character assassination. Farage's fury was personal, political, and painfully justified. And he wasn't alone. Across the country, a wave of support surged behind his demand. Social media lit up with stories of women who had waited decades for someone to acknowledge what happened to them. Campaigners and survivors groups, who had been mocked and sidelined, were finally being heard. Not because Starmer saw the light, but because the weight of truth had become impossible to bury. One survivor tweeted, "He called us far right. Now he wants credit for an inquiry? Where was he when we needed him?" That single line captured a national mood, of betrayal, of delayed justice, and of rage at a system that protected predators more than victims. Meanwhile, Conservative MPs, who had once tiptoed around the issue, now rushed to get ahead of the story. Some even pretended they had always supported a national inquiry, even though they had remained silent for years. But the records speak for themselves. This wasn't just a Labour failure. This was a cross-party catastrophe enabled by cowardice, media compliance, and a culture where community cohesion was placed above child safety. That's what the Casey report threatens to lay bare, and it's why Starmer is now doing everything he can to get in front of the wreckage. But there's something else behind Farage's demand for an apology, something far deeper. He understands that this scandal isn't just about policy or law enforcement, it's about morality, about whether the people who lead this country are willing to stand up for the most vulnerable, even when it's politically inconvenient. And in that test, Keir Starmer failed. Time and again, he chose silence over action, optics over justice. And now he wants applause for finally doing the bare minimum. Even worse, Starmer's team has made no indication that he plans to apologise, not even a hint of regret. Instead, they are spinning the narrative as a bold step by a serious leader, as though the Prime Minister just woke up to this issue yesterday. But the truth is simple. This is not leadership. This is survival. He has seen the polls, felt the pressure, and realised that ignoring this scandal any longer would destroy what little trust remains in his party. It's not principle. It's panic. As Farage said in a searing broadcast, what about the victims? Where's their apology? Where's the justice for girls who were trafficked under the noses of police and politicians while Starmer looked the other way? Those are the questions that now haunt this government. Because this isn't a minor policy issue. This is a moral failure on a national scale. And no inquiry, however sweeping, can undo the years of betrayal without accountability. Behind every cover-up is a machinery built to silence. And in the grooming gang scandal, that machinery wasn't some shadowy group operating in the dark. It was councils, police forces, social workers, and yes, even MPs. Many of them were Labour. Many of them knew. And many of them did nothing, or worse. They targeted those who tried to speak out. Take Oldham, for example. When a whistleblower came forward, a woman who had worked closely with social services and tried to expose what was happening, she was threatened with arrest. Her crime? Telling the truth. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated effort to keep the scandal buried. When she sounded the alarm about young girls being handed back to their abusers or left unprotected, she was called problematic. Not the criminals, the whistleblower. That tells you everything. And it wasn't just her. In Rotherham, council officials repeatedly ignored reports, even as hundreds of girls were raped, beaten, and trafficked in plain sight. Some of those girls went to the police and were arrested themselves. Victims were treated as liars, or worse, as willing participants. Meanwhile, senior officials were too afraid to act, obsessed with not being called racist, even as gangs of Pakistani heritage men preyed on vulnerable white girls across towns and cities. The rot ran deep, and Labour's fingerprints were all over it. Anne Cryer, a Labour MP, tried to raise the alarm as far back as the early 2000s. What did her own party do? They branded her racist and tried to silence her. That's right, Labour turned on one of their own for telling the truth. And when journalist Andrew Norfolk uncovered the depth of the horror in Rotherham, it was already too late for more than 1,400 girls. That's not an accident. That's institutional cowardice. And yet, for years, Labour officials continued to downplay, deflect, and distract, all to avoid a confrontation with reality. Starmer now claims he's changed his tune. But during those years when whistleblowers begged for attention, where was he? As Director of Public Prosecutions, he oversaw a justice system that was supposed to protect the weak and prosecute the wicked. Instead, under his tenure, grooming gangs were allowed to operate with shocking impunity. And when he had the chance to push for national reform, he said nothing. He let it slide. Because raising the issue might have caused political discomfort. Meanwhile, Labour-run councils across the UK were adopting what they called community cohesion strategies, which in practice meant don't rock the boat. Even if girls were being raped, officials were instructed not to name the ethnicity of the perpetrators, to protect race relations. Imagine that, protecting the reputations of criminals at the expense of children. That is what this party defended for years. That is what Starmer oversaw in silence. And now they want credit for launching a long-overdue inquiry? In Telford, the 2022 inquiry revealed decades of failure. Thousands of children had been abused while local authorities did nothing. And yet, even after this came out, the government refused to launch a national inquiry. Until now. Only after media pressure, survivor testimonies, and political embarrassment did Starmer finally blink. And even now, he hasn't apologised. He hasn't fired anyone. He hasn't admitted Labour's central role in this horror. He's hoping the inquiry will be seen as leadership. But the victims see it differently. They see it as a shield, an excuse to avoid personal accountability. The most shocking part? The deportation issue. Hundreds of men have been convicted. Yet since 2011, only one grooming gang member has been deported. Just one. The rest? Many still live in the UK, some even near their victims. That's what Labour and the Tories let happen. That's the consequence of years of paralysis, excuse-making, and betrayal. And now we're told this new inquiry will consider deportations to India, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. That's a step in the right direction, yes, but only if it's actually enforced. Only if it's more than lip service. Because victims aren't just demanding truth, they're demanding justice. And justice doesn't come through carefully worded reports or staged press conferences. It comes through action. Arrests, deportations, resignations, apologies. But let's not forget, those who tried to expose the truth were punished, fired, discredited, dragged through the mud, while those who covered it up were promoted, knighted, or allowed to quietly retire. This is not just a scandal about abuse. It's a scandal about how the system devours the truth to protect the powerful. Starmer may have opened the door to an inquiry, but the question now is whether the country will finally tear down the fortress that kept this horror hidden for so long. For over 2 decades, the British media, mainstream outlets trusted to hold power to account, failed. Not just in tone or detail, but fundamentally. They failed to investigate, failed to challenge, and in many cases, actively participated in hiding the truth. The grooming gang scandal didn't remain hidden because no one knew. It remained hidden because the people in charge of informing the public decided it wasn't a story worth telling. Or worse, they feared telling it. BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Sky News, all of them had access to the same information. Whistleblowers were talking, victims were speaking, reports were circulating. But instead of blowing the story wide open, editors and producers sat on it. They feared the consequences. Not the consequences of children being raped in industrial numbers, but the consequences of being called racist. That's what decades of political correctness and institutional cowardice produced. A media culture more afraid of offending sensibilities than protecting children. When Andrew Norfolk finally broke the Rotherham story in the Times, it wasn't because no one had tried before, it was because everyone else had looked the other way. Norfolk took the risk others wouldn't. And even then, he was vilified. Accused of inflaming racial tensions, accused of targeting minorities, accused of being politically motivated. All for exposing the single largest child sex abuse scandal in modern British history. Ask yourself, where was the BBC during this time? Why didn't they have wall-to-wall coverage of the testimonies, the failures, the patterns emerging across northern towns? When the post office scandal broke, they dedicated hours of primetime to it, dramatised it, brought it to every living room in Britain. But when thousands of girls were drugged, raped and trafficked by coordinated gangs, the headlines were minimal. Carefully worded, sanitised, buried. And what about Channel 4? Only recently did they finally air a serious documentary about grooming gangs. But by then, the damage had been done. Years of inaction, years of silence, had allowed this abuse to flourish. The media wasn't just a passive observer, it became part of the cover-up. Editors were instructed not to use phrases like Pakistani men, even when court documents confirmed it. Journalists who pursued the story were told to change the angle or drop it altogether. Viewers were given half-truths, if anything at all. Social media changed that. With the rise of platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, ordinary people began sharing their own stories. Independent outlets like GB News, Rebel Media, and others picked up what legacy outlets refused to touch. And that's when things started to shift. Elon Musk, who recently amplified a GB News report, brought the conversation global. When someone with that kind of platform says the British establishment is covering up the rape of working-class girls, the world listens. And now, as the inquiry finally begins, the media is scrambling to rewrite its own role in this story. Suddenly, BBC is talking about decades of silence, as if they weren't a central part of it. Suddenly, they're inviting campaigners onto panels, airing victim interviews, and covering protests. But for the families who screamed into the void for years, this is too little, too late. The reason the media refused to act is because they were institutionally aligned with the same political class that failed these girls. They drank from the same ideological well. For years, political journalists were more interested in maintaining access to Labour's spin machine than challenging it. For years, editors feared being called xenophobic more than they feared children being brutalised. And the media didn't just cover up the crimes, they smeared the truth-tellers. Maggie Oliver, the former detective who exposed the failures in Greater Manchester, was branded difficult and emotional. Tommy Robinson, controversial as he is, went to jail for trying to expose grooming gangs on camera. Whatever you think of him, the fact remains, he did more to highlight these crimes than many blue-chip journalists ever did. They turned the word grooming gang into a taboo. You couldn't say it on air without a disclaimer. You couldn't discuss it without pivoting to not all men or don't generalise. Even as victims described the exact same pattern. Groups of older men, mostly of Pakistani heritage, preying on vulnerable white girls in towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Telford, Oldham. The media refused to connect the dots. And when they did cover the trials, they used vague terms: Asian men, local men, or sometimes just a group. This wasn't about protecting journalistic integrity. This was about protecting political narratives. Because if the truth got out, if the public truly grasped the scale, the race dynamics, the institutional betrayal, the backlash would threaten the very foundations of multicultural policy in Britain. And the media couldn't risk that. Now that Starmer has announced a national inquiry, you'd think the media would be leading the charge. But once again, they are playing catch-up. They are being reactive, not proactive. And we must remember they only moved when forced. When independent journalists embarrassed them. When victims went viral. When political pressure mounted. When people like Nigel Farage and Elon Musk threw their weight into the debate. Only then did the media blink. If you want to see the media's real priorities, just look at how they've responded to Baroness Casey's report. Leaks suggest the report confirms what everyone knew. The gangs were overwhelmingly Pakistani, the victims white and working class, and the state was complicit. Yet major outlets still ran headlines that danced around the core truth. Even now, the framing is cautious, hesitant, and riddled with euphemisms. Why? Because the fear of being branded racist still trumps the need for justice. The media has learned nothing, and that's why independent voices matter more than ever. Because while the BBC worried about offending sensibilities, girls were locked in rooms, pumped with drugs, and raped by dozens of men in a single night. While Sky News argued over language, families buried daughters who took their own lives after years of abuse. While ITV sought balance, the truth was being erased. The silence of the media wasn't neutral, it was political. And as this inquiry moves forward, we must hold not just the politicians to account, but the press itself. They could have prevented years of suffering. They didn't. And now they must answer for it. So now we arrive at the moment Britain has waited decades for. A national inquiry is finally underway. Keir Starmer, under crushing pressure from victims, campaigners, whistleblowers, Nigel Farage, and even members of the royal family, has been forced to act, forced to confront the horror that has lurked in the shadows of our nation for far too long, forced to address what is undeniably one of the darkest, most damning failures of the British state in modern history. But as this inquiry begins, long overdue, reluctantly launched and surrounded by public scepticism, the question now is simple. Will justice actually be done, or are we witnessing just another chapter in the long saga of whitewashes and betrayals? Let's not pretend this U-turn came from moral courage. It didn't. Keir Starmer had every opportunity to act sooner. He had the power, he had the reports, he had the voices of victims screaming at his doorstep. But like so many in Westminster, he turned his back, until it became impossible to ignore, until GB News made it headline news, until Baroness Casey's report exposed the institutional cowardice, until Elon Musk lit up Twitter with outrage and forced the conversation beyond the corridors of Whitehall. And only then, did the Prime Minister decide to act. Now, we're told this will be a statutory inquiry. That sounds powerful, it sounds official. It means witnesses can be forced to testify. But will they? Or will we see the same parade of vague statements, shredded documents, and slippery officials dodging responsibility like we did with the Post Office Horizon scandal? Will the real perpetrators, those who raped, those who facilitated, those who covered it up, face the full weight of justice? Or will they disappear into the background again, protected by the same system that enabled their crimes in the first place? Let's talk deportation. One of the most shocking statistics revealed recently is that out of over 400 convictions for grooming gang-related offences since 2000, there has been just one confirmed deportation since 2011. Just one. Think about that. Hundreds of men found guilty of gang-raping British girls, of trafficking them across towns, of threatening them, drugging them, destroying their childhoods. And almost all of them still here, walking freely in the country whose laws they mocked and whose daughters they desecrated. Why? Because politicians were too afraid. Because lawyers built excuses. Because some whispered behind closed doors, we can't inflame community tensions, we can't risk the backlash. So, to avoid backlash, they let the abusers stay. And now, with this inquiry, Starmer says everything will be on the table, including deportation of offenders from India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and other countries where dual nationality applies. But again, will it really happen? Or will this be another clever line in a press release that means nothing in reality? And what about the police chiefs who refused to investigate? The council leaders who shredded complaints? The child protection officers who ignored desperate pleas? Will they be named and shamed? Will they be prosecuted? Will they face a single consequence for allowing vulnerable girls to be tortured on their watch? Just look at what happened after Alexis Jay's 2014 Rotherham report. Over 1,400 girls abused between 1997 and 2013. Clear evidence, a report that stunned the nation. And what happened? A few resignations, a few sorries, but no real justice. Many of the men named in those reports are still free. Some victims still see their rapists walking the same streets. Because despite the findings, despite the outrage, the system still protected itself. And that's why this inquiry cannot just be another review. Another polite hearing where everyone nods solemnly and no one goes to jail. It has to be a reckoning. The inquiry must name names. It must tear down the firewall that has kept truth out and rot in. It must be televised, unredacted, and relentless. Victims need to be heard, not tokenised, not sanitised. Their stories must be front and centre, raw and real. The nation needs to feel their pain, because only then will people understand the scale of betrayal. Only then will they grasp the cost of political correctness, of cowardice, of turning away. Because this didn't just happen randomly. These crimes were allowed to persist because an entire political and bureaucratic culture evolved, one where protecting multicultural optics mattered more than protecting children, where the fear of being called racist silenced professionals, gagged whistleblowers, and allowed predators to flourish. That ideology, deeply embedded in the civil service, in the police, in councils, in newsrooms, must be named and destroyed. This isn't about race. It's about a pattern. It's about truth. The inquiry must confront this ideology head-on, not dance around it, not obscure it with euphemisms, not bury it under jargon. It must say plainly, the system failed because it was more afraid of racism accusations than of rapists. That's the hard truth, and it must be spoken. So what now? What comes next? Full public access. Every session must be televised, every document released. No closed doors, no secret deals. Transparency is non-negotiable. Names must be named. No more shielding the guilty behind operational failures or lessons learned. We want names, we want roles, we want dates. Accountability for past inquiries. The J report, the IICSA. Why did they fall short? Who watered them down? Who dodged responsibility? The new inquiry must investigate the failures of past inquiries. Because if we don't do these things, then this is just theatre. Just another performance to keep the mob quiet. Just another betrayal of the same girls who have already been betrayed 1,000 times over. And we must keep the pressure on. The public must watch this inquiry like hawks. Independent journalists must cover every development. Victims must continue speaking out. Politicians must be held accountable every single day. Because you can bet there are powerful forces who want this to fade, who want the heat to die down, who want to say, we've done the inquiry, time to move on. But we are not moving on. Not until every girl gets justice. Not until every perpetrator is named. Not until every coward in authority is exposed. Not until Britain can look its daughters in the eyes and say, we failed you, but never again. And to Keir Starmer, we say this: you can't rewrite your role now. You resisted this inquiry. You hesitated. You mocked those who demanded it. You let victims suffer in silence. You only acted when the pressure became unbearable. That's not leadership. That's damage control. You owe the victims not just an inquiry, you owe them an apology. And so does every MP, every bureaucrat, every media executive who played a part in this horror. This is Britain's last chance to prove that justice still exists in this country, that the rule of law still means something, that truth can still win. The victims have waited long enough. It's a turning point. For too long, Britain turned away from its most vulnerable. Now the truth is finally being dragged into the light. But don't be fooled by press statements and polished promises. Justice won't come unless we demand it, loudly, relentlessly, and without apology. Starmer may have launched this inquiry, but we'll be watching every step. No more cover-ups, no more excuses, no more silence. Share your opinions in the comments and subscribe our channel for more UK news. Thank you.